Okay, you've got to help me. There's this creature that it's killed everybody. Absolutely everybody has died. Oh my God, it's found me. No, it's no. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of How to Be a Great GM. We're talking slasher villains. Now, if you are not aware of how I categorize the different levels of enemies within a game, we have villains, we have henchmen, and then we have the nemesis. The nemesis sits right at the top in the back of the campaign. Then we have a villain who is basically your weekly baddie, your big monster that comes through, your big bad that the player characters are going to encounter on a weekly basis and overcome on a weekly basis. And then you have henchmen who are there just to basically die. So when we talk slasher villains have been around for a long time. Darth Vader is a slasher villain. He literally slashes. Kylo Ren is just a whiny, I nearly said a bad word, villain. Anyway. We have all of these slasher creatures. But playing a slasher monster villain in your campaign is not just as simple as having this heavily armored or armed individual who goes around cutting things up. We talk about blunt force trauma when we talk about slasher villains. Now, we're not talking about an actual hammer. Some slashers might actually use a hammer to be more impactful. Haha, so the puns do flow. We talk blunt force trauma and we unpack what does a blunt force trauma type of villain do. A never present can't be a slasher villain. You can't have a villain who slashes from the background that nobody notices. That's not the point of a slasher villain. A slasher villain is there to traumatize, to terrorize, and to be the star of this particular sort of almost horror genre that you might throw into your games to really get the blood going of your players. We look very briefly at the psychology, and then we look at the powers that slasher villains need to have in order for them to be truly, truly effective as slasher villains. A slasher villain can only be as good as you empower them to be. So we talk blunt force trauma. Blunt force trauma, whether that's the nemesis or the villain or the henchman, but in this case particularly, the blunt force trauma slasher villain is always there. That's an important key. Now, when you look at something like the Aliens movies, where that's definitely a slasher puncturer type of being, that's definitely something that's hunting the crew. They're always there. Even if we can't see them, we can sense them. The velociraptors from Jurassic Park, that telltale claw clicking, that breathing, that sound, that means they're always there. So when you are running a slasher villain with your party, you need to make sure that the party is aware that the slasher is nearby. Now, the biggest challenge that you are going to face is that the PCs are going to want to face down that slasher villain in Mortal Kombat. PCs have a certain sense of immortality when it comes to facing enemies. So what you need to do is you need to give the PCs a whole bunch of NPCs for the slasher victim to be slasher victims. The slasher will slice and dice and cut them up, even though they appear to be stronger than the PCs themselves. So a heavily armored paladin, a highly skilled military veteran, they need to go into that fight to show the PCs, wait a second, you can't just fight this thing, because so often your slasher villains become a slasher henchman who gets mown down in the first round of combat because the PCs overpower the slasher villain. So that is something that you have to bear in mind. Now, there's something that we're going to be doing a little bit later on, which is going to make a lot of you very angry, but it is going to make your slasher villain that much more memorable. So they need to always be there, whether it's a sound or a breathing which is sound or a smell. It could be the scent that's there, always this sort of bloody scent or this rotting scent. It could be a scent. It could be feeling. The air becomes electrical, or the air becomes very cold as the being starts to approach, if it's some kind of ethereal, ghost-like thing. Think about a sense and then engage that sense as much as you can. In horror films, it's audio, and lack of visual. Only later do we see the actual creature itself. So it is always there. It is actively after the PCs. Now, this is, again, something that we tend to forget about when we're running slashers, is that they need to always be after the PCs. If they have the capacity to talk, and very seldom, by the way, do slasher villains talk. If you think of your traditional slasher villains, you've got the alien. It doesn't talk very much at all, ever, right? You have the alien. You have Freddy, who, yes, there is some psychological trauma that's going on there. You've got the slasher murderer from the Scream series. You've got Jason, who, again, doesn't talk very much. So slashers generally don't communicate much with the characters, but they make sure that the PCs realize they are after them and them alone. They don't care about anybody else. Everybody else is just meat for them to cut their way through to get to the PCs. So you need to figure out, why is it that it is after the PCs? Is it because the PCs stole its eggs and it wants its eggs back? Is it because the PCs intruded into its territory and now they need to get out of its territory before it will stop hunting them? Is it because the PCs were the third child born on a full moon on the 5th day of the 17th month, just before the milkman forgot to do his rounds, and so the monster is hunting them because it thinks that they are the chosen one? You need to establish why the slasher is after the PCs, and you need to let the PCs know as well. So if you look at a classic case of Alien, or Aliens, or Alien 3, or Alien 4, for that matter, why is the alien after the PCs in that particular instance? Because they're on the ship that it is on and it can't go anywhere else. It needs to hunt them down, to use them, sometimes to impregnate them, sometimes just to rip them to pieces. It sees them as a threat to its domain. It can't go anywhere else because there is nowhere else for it to go. So it needs to be actively after the PCs, and it needs to be visible to the PCs. So now, we were talking originally about always being there and engaging the senses: sight, smell, touch, taste, feel, etc. It needs to be visibly after the PCs as well. It can't be an unknown, oh, it could be 6 of those, it could be 12 of those, it could be some of these, it could be some of that. It can't be that. It needs to be a full-blown, identifiable creature. Even if it's morphing, if it's changing, if it's adapting, if it's growing, those kinds of things, it still needs to be visible to the PC so that they know what's after them. So that they know, oh, when I hear that sound, it's that monster, that villain that is after us. So we need to make sure the PCs, at least one of them, needs to see it in its entirety, so that then it starts to add that dread. Now, the psychology of a slasher beast. Slashers are a metagame minefield, and you need to be very, very careful of this fact, because in films and in literature, it kind of works that these monsters seem to just know where the characters are going all the time, and just somehow manage to get there ahead of them to be able to attack them the moment they think they're safe. So they need to get inside the PC's heads. How do you get inside the PC's head? Well, look at the PC's backstory. If the PC's a good player and suddenly the beast comes out dressed as a little thatched doll, because in the PC's background they had a thatched doll which they accidentally set on fire, and so now they believe they're responsible for all pyromaniacs all over the world, use that. Use it. Get inside the PC's heads. Let it feel as if the beast knows what they're thinking and can simply just get there. Like I said, it has to want something. So If the PCs are in its territory, it must want to get them out of its territory or simply to kill them for violating its territory in the first place. If it wants its eggs back, once it's got its eggs back, it will then go and hunt them down for having stolen the eggs in the first place. So it must want something, but it must also play with the PCs. Now, this is where it gets really fun for you as the game master. Is, yes, you get a sense that this thing is right behind you. You spin around, it's not there. You then hear a scream. It's Shelley, the one NPC whom you thought was dead, who's actually not dead. She's screaming for help and you can hear her just round the corner. The PCs are automatically going to think it's a trap. We've watched enough movies to know that it is. Until her screaming stops and she starts humming, or she starts talking that she's alone, is kind of want to hear her. So she's really going to drive the PCs to want to get to go and find out what's going on with her. Obviously, when they arrive, she's wounded, but fine. She'll tell them that the monster just left her alone. The slasher left her alone. It hasn't. It's used her as bait to allow the PCs to get together in this environment, which then is going to trigger. And that might be quicksand. It might be other creatures that get released as a result. Maybe she's been impregnated with this strange virus, or the larva of something else that the slasher has brought with it to impregnate into, to basically just play with the PCs. You can go mad here. Really ratchet up the tension against them. Have this slasher villain basically have been sitting there going, if only someone would come into my territory, because I've got all of these amazing things lined up for the poor bastards who wander into my space. I am going to screw with their little minds because I have had years of planning. Relish that moment. Make it usable. And the other important thing is that it plays with the PCs. It doesn't kill them. So when it encounters the PCs, and it should encounter the PCs, and we're getting to that point that you're going to hate me for, but when it encounters those PCs, it should get them to the brink of death. It should get them to the point that they have no hope. That's what it's ultimately feeding on, is that these characters, these player characters, need to get to the point where they are hopeless, and it will then kill them, because then it's had fun in doing so. So that's where we then get to its power. It does lots of damage when it needs to. And when it doesn't need to, it then holds back on that damage. So it stabs the first PC, and it slashes the PC, and it does 30 points of damage. And then the next attack, 30 points of damage is going to kill you, right? Yes. It then takes the knife, and it just jabs it between your ribs and twists it, and you take 15 points of damage. It then pushes you aside and moves on to the next one. Seemingly immortal. This is where I would advocate that your slasher villain, for the first 3 or 4 encounters that you are going to have it engage with the PCs, it doesn't have hit points. It just takes all the damage. Just soaks it up. Takes every single little bit. Maybe if the PCs have dealt 200 or 300 points of damage to it because they've really well prepared and you haven't given it enough immunities, maybe then have it leak a little bit of blood. Once the PCs are suitably terrified of this creature, of this villain, and they're going, we did so much damage to it, and it didn't even flinch. Once they are at that point, and they are now running from this thing, and they are actively trying to get away from it because they can't possibly defeat it, now you switch over. Now suddenly, in the combat, the PCs can take a stance. They can fight back. They can draw blood, whether it's acidic blood or blue blood or whatever. They can now start to make a difference. So at first, it seems insurmountable. It seems like it's an impossibly immortal being. And then as it starts to wear down the PCs, as the PCs start to draw on the last reserves that they possibly have, now suddenly the PCs discover a weakness. They discover that the creature isn't like fire, or they discover that the creature is susceptible to silver bullets, or you pick a thing. Excuse me. Load the villain up with as much immunities and powers as you need for them to be able to survive a couple encounters with the PCs initially. And again, always present. So in your adventure structure, what we're going to be doing is you're going to look at how to introduce that monster, that villain, plus why the PCs are being hunted by that villain. It's very important that you introduce that right up front before you start going anywhere else. It allows the PCs to then have to try and formulate plans. These creatures are after us because we live in their house. These beings are after us because we stole their eggs, because we violated their sacred rights, because of whatever. So it gives the PCs an opportunity to resolve the situation. Very seldom do the PCs resolve the situation in a simple showdown of strength. Sometimes they do, but generally speaking, the showdown of strength, the PCs think they've won, and then they discover that they actually haven't won because the immortal creature comes back to life. They have to resolve the reason why the creature was after them in the first place. Maybe that's getting out of the territory or resolving the ritual, etc., etc. You have to make sure that that creature is inside the minds of the characters, so don't worry about things like, well, the characters can move at 100 foot around and the villain can only move at 50 foot around, so the characters are just going to outrun it. Yes, somehow the characters will indeed outrun the creature, but the creature or the villain knows that there is a secret tunnel which only it knows about that allows it to cover the same distance in half the time, and the characters can only be heading towards that little spot there because the creature's inside the characters' heads. It's not responding how it normally would. So this is very much a metagame kind of space where you as the GM are creating this really cool adventure. The PCs should survive, by the way. This is not a way to kill PCs. These monsters are unfairly stacked against the PCs. This is about giving the PCs a horrific romp with a slasher villain, with someone who is very evil, someone who's very powerful, someone who is just malicious and just wants to hurt the party. And so at the end of it, when the party kills this villain, there is a sense of absolute satisfaction that the party has overcome tremendous odds and can now move on and sleep better at night. If you can pull off a slasher villain successfully, your party is going to have an absolute blast. Utilize the senses, utilize the psychology, utilize all of the powers that you can to make your slasher villain terrifying. Until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of gaming. Right. Okay, enough from you. Thank you very much. Did you hit the like button? Yes, you did. Open or drip or drool or something. I don't know. You did. Okay. Did you hit the subscribe button? That's an important one. The subscribe button. Don't look away. Hey, look. Did you hit the subscribe button? Yes. No. No, you didn't. Well, go and hit the subscribe button. And while you're at it, hit the Goblin Bell as well, because I'm talking to you. Hey, don't you wander across the screen. Thank you very much. Listen here, you little bastard. You should just grow up yourself. Yes, just grow up into something that's actually going to benefit everybody. Kids these days.